Maya Robinson realized something was wrong the moment she recognized the tattoo on the armrest of the chair. It wasn't just similar, it was exact, down to the faded ink and placement. Her uncle had vanished 13 years ago, and now his mark was stitched into furniture at an estate auction. What no one in that room understood yet was that this chair wasn't inspired by human suffering, it was made from it. Maya Robinson arrived at the edge of Ravenhill Estate, just as the late afternoon light began to dull, the sun sinking low enough to stretch long shadows across the iron gates. The place looked abandoned, even with people gathered outside an old southern mansion sagging under the weight of time. Its white paint yellowed, its columns cracked, its windows dark like unblinking eyes. For more than 2 decades, this house had been a local legend in Savannah, a seasonal attraction whispered about every October. A haunted experience so realistic that people bragged about surviving it. Now its owner was dead, the doors were open for the last time, and everything inside was being sold off to strangers with numbered paddles and curious smiles. Maya hadn't planned to come. She told herself that as she stepped through the gate, weaving past antique dealers, collectors, and tourists snapping photos as if this were just another quirky stop on a historic walking tour. She was 23, a recent graduate still figuring out what came next, still carrying the quiet weight of unresolved grief she rarely spoke about. Ravenhill Estate had always unsettled her, even when she was younger and only heard stories about it. Friends talked about the hyper-realistic props, the way the rooms smelled wrong, the strange feeling that followed you out into the street afterward. Maya had always brushed it off as hype, but she never went. Some part of her didn't want to. Some part of her felt pulled away long before she ever understood why. Inside, the air was cool and stale, heavy with dust and old wood. Auction staff had placed small white tags on everything, mirrors with tarnished frames, tables scarred by decades of use, lamps with shades thin enough to glow strangely when the light hit them just right. The decor leaned hard into Gothic excess, as if the house itself refused to let go of the role it had played for so long. Maya moved slowly, hands in her jacket pockets, letting the crowd pass around her. She wasn't looking to buy anything. She told herself she was only curious, only here to see what everyone had been talking about for years. The mansion's main parlor was larger than she expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in a muted, grayish light. It felt wrong to see the room like this, quiet, exposed, stripped of darkness. This space had been designed for fear, for carefully controlled shadows and screams on cue. Now it was filled with murmurs, the soft click of camera shutters, the low hum of people assessing value. Maya felt a tightness in her chest as she stepped farther inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots. That was when she noticed the chair. It sat slightly apart from the rest of the furniture, positioned against the far wall as if it needed space to breathe. It was an ornate armchair, tall, backed with curved wooden arms and clawed feet, upholstered in what appeared to be aged brown leather. At first glance, it looked expensive, the kind of piece that might anchor a study or sit untouched in a collector's home. But the longer Maya looked at it, the more unsettled she felt. The surface wasn't smooth. The material carried strange variations in texture, subtle shapes that didn't look like wear or decorative tooling. There was something almost organic about it, something that made her stomach tighten in quiet warning. She moved closer without fully deciding to. The crowd noise faded into the background as she focused on the chair, on the way the upholstery seemed stretched too tightly in some places and looser in others. Faces appeared in the material, not carved, not painted, but suggested. Distorted impressions where eyes should have been, mouths pulled into frozen expressions that might have been screaming once. Maya swallowed hard. This was what people meant when they said Ravenhill's props were too real. This was the artistry everyone praised. Then she saw the armrest. On the outer edge, half faded and unmistakable, was a small tattoo, a simple cross, the ink worn into a dull blue-gray by time. Maya stopped breathing. The world narrowed to that single detail, that single mark. She leaned in closer, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone nearby must hear it. The tattoo wasn't just similar. It was exact. Same size, same placement, same slight unevenness in the lines. She had seen that tattoo countless times growing up. Seen it when she was a child sitting on the floor, while her uncle rolled up his sleeve and smiled down at her. Marcus. Her uncle Marcus Robinson had disappeared 13 years ago. She had been 10 then. Old enough to understand that something was wrong but too young to grasp why the adults around her spoke in careful half-sentences. Marcus had been a constant presence in her early life, funny, protective, always sketching in the margins of notebooks or on scrap paper. After the military, after things changed, he still tried to show up, still tried to be himself. And then one day he was just gone. No goodbye. No explanation. Just absence that hardened into years of unanswered questions. Maya's hands began to shake. She reached out before she could stop herself and brushed her fingers lightly against the armrest. The sensation sent a jolt through her body. It wasn't leather. It wasn't even close. The surface was too soft, too warm, too responsive beneath her touch. She pulled her hand back as if burned, nausea rising fast and sharp. Her gaze darted to the back of the chair, scanning it desperately, as if part of her hoped she was wrong. Hoped there would be something, anything that broke the connection her mind was making. There, high on the backrest, was a dark, irregular patch, a birthmark. Maya felt the room tilt. That mark had been on Marcus's upper back since birth. A shape her mother used to point out in old photographs. A detail etched into family memory. Maya had seen it at summer cookouts, at the pool, in moments so ordinary they now felt impossibly distant. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her vision blurring as the truth crashed into her all at once, brutal and undeniable. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't art inspired by reality. This was reality hidden in plain sight. People continued to move around her, unaware, chatting softly about bids and craftsmanship. Someone laughed nearby. Maya felt a scream build in her chest, hot and uncontrollable. The chair loomed in front of her, no longer an object but a revelation, a grave disguised as furniture. Her uncle hadn't vanished from the city. He hadn't moved on. He had been here the entire time, transformed into something meant to be touched, admired, sat upon. Maya screamed, and the sound shattered the room. The death of Edgar Holloway had been quiet, almost disappointingly ordinary for a man whose life's work thrived on fear. A heart attack, they said. 71 years old, found alone in his bedroom at Ravenhill Estate, no signs of struggle. No dramatic end to match the mythology he had built around himself. The news barely made the local paper beyond a short article buried between zoning updates and restaurant reviews. To most people in Savannah, Holloway was just the eccentric owner of a seasonal haunted attraction, reclusive, strange, but harmless enough. When the doors of Ravenhill finally closed for good, there was no public mourning. Only speculation about what would become of the house and its contents. The answer came quickly. With no close family stepping forward to claim the property, the estate passed into the hands of a court-appointed executor, who wasted little time arranging a liquidation. Ravenhill was expensive to maintain and carried too much unsettling history to be repurposed easily. Selling it as a private residence would have required extensive renovations, inspections, disclosures. Selling the contents was simpler. Everything inside would be cataloged, appraised, and auctioned off, stripped of context and memory, reduced to individual items with estimated values and lot numbers. In the weeks leading up to the auction, rumors spread. Antique dealers whispered about unique furniture pieces that had never been seen outside the house. Horror memorabilia collectors speculated online about one-of-a-kind props crafted by Holloway himself. Some locals expressed relief that Ravenhill would finally be dismantled, its influence erased from the neighborhood. Others felt an odd nostalgia, remembering teenage dares and October nights spent screaming through its halls. Very few asked where Holloway had sourced his materials, or how he had managed to operate alone for so long. The house had always been unsettling, but discomfort, when profitable, has a way of being ignored. The auction preview day was meant to be practical. Buyers wanted to inspect items before bidding, to assess condition, craftsmanship, authenticity. Auction staff moved efficiently through the mansion, taping numbered tags to furniture and setting up cordoned viewing areas. They worked around the lingering atmosphere as best they could, laughing nervously at the darker rooms, making jokes about needing sage or holy water once the job was done. To them, Ravenhill was a temporary inconvenience, a strange assignment that would soon be over. Holloway's life revealed itself only in fragments through the things he left behind. His office contained meticulous financial records, neatly organized and boringly normal. His bedroom was sparse, almost monk-like, stripped of decoration. There were no family photos, no personal letters, no evidence of meaningful relationships. The house itself seemed to have been his only companion, every room shaped around its function as a stage for fear. He had lived alone, worked alone, and died alone, leaving behind questions no one had thought to ask while he was alive. As word spread that the contents of Ravenhill were for sale, a strange mix of people arrived. Professional appraisers with trained eyes and neutral expressions. Collectors hungry for something rare and disturbing. Locals driven by curiosity rather than intent to buy. Some treated the event like entertainment, snapping photos and swapping stories about their experiences in the house. Others moved more quietly, visibly uneasy, as if being inside Ravenhill in daylight stripped away the illusion and left only something raw and wrong behind. No one mentioned the missing people. Over the years, there had been occasional rumors, whispers about how real the props felt, how warm some surfaces seemed even in cold rooms, how certain displays left visitors shaken in ways that went beyond manufactured fear. But those rumors were always drowned out by praise for Holloway's artistry, his commitment to realism. In a city built on ghost tours and curated horror, Ravenhill had fit too neatly into the landscape to be questioned deeply. Darkness, when packaged correctly, becomes novelty. The auction house employees followed protocol. Items were listed by style and estimated era, stripped of any association with the man who made them. Victorian-inspired chairs, Gothic tables, custom-built lighting fixtures. The language was clinical, detached, designed to encourage betting rather than reflection. No one wrote Edgar Holloway's name on the tags. His presence lingered anyway, in the careful arrangement of the rooms, in the way certain pieces were positioned as if they still needed to perform. Outside, the line to enter grew steadily. The estate preview became an event, something to do on an otherwise quiet afternoon. People stepped through the iron gates with coffee cups in hand, unaware that they were walking into a place that had never truly been empty. Even now, the house seemed to watch them, patient, silent, as if it had learned long ago that secrets last longest when no one thinks to look for them. By the time Maya Robinson arrived, the auction had already been underway for hours. The staff had grown accustomed to the steady flow of bodies, to the questions and the murmurs and the casual handling of things that once existed only in carefully lit darkness. They had no reason to expect disruption. To them, this was just another estate sale, albeit an unusually macabre one. Holloway was dead. The house was finished. Whatever history it held was assumed to have died with him. What none of them understood yet was that Ravenhill Estate was not giving up its secrets willingly. The house had been built to hide things, to transform horror into spectacle and suffering into decor. The auction was not an ending. It was an unveiling, the first crack in a facade that had held for more than 20 years. Edgar Holloway had designed Ravenhill to outlive him, to continue telling his story without words. He never needed accomplices, never needed an audience that understood the truth. All he needed was a system that valued objects over people, novelty over scrutiny, and silence over questions. The auction provided exactly that, a room full of eyes trained to see price and craftsmanship, not humanity. And so the doors remained open, the tags remained in place, and the house waited. It waited for someone who wasn't looking to buy. Someone who recognized memory instead of material. Someone who would look at a piece of furniture and see a life instead of a commodity. The auction was meant to erase Edgar Holloway's presence from Savannah, to scatter the remnants of Ravenhill into private collections and storage units across the country. Instead, it became the moment his crimes finally surfaced, Not through investigation or suspicion, but through recognition. Through the simple, devastating truth that some horrors cannot be disguised forever, no matter how carefully they are stitched into something familiar. By the end of that day, Ravenhill Estate would no longer be just a haunted house with a dead owner. It would become something else entirely, a crime scene, a reckoning, and a reminder that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly, tagged and appraised, until the right person walks into the room and finally sees what everyone else chose not to. Maya found herself standing in front of the chair longer than she meant to, caught in a quiet standoff she couldn't explain. It wasn't the largest piece in the room, nor the most elaborate, yet it commanded attention in a way that made everything else feel secondary. The longer she looked at it, the more the noise of the auction faded into something distant and unimportant. Her body reacted before her mind did, a slow tightening in her chest, a warning she had learned to recognize but never fully trusted. This chair wasn't just unsettling. It felt deliberate, as if it had been placed there knowing someone like her would eventually walk into the room. At first glance, it passed easily as a high-end antique. The frame was solid, dark wood carved into elegant curves that spoke of age and craftsmanship. The legs ended in clawed feet, polished just enough to suggest care rather than restoration. It was the kind of piece collectors loved, something that could be described as character, rich, or authentically worn. The upholstery, a deep brown that mimicked aged leather, appeared cracked in places, textured with what could have been decades of use. Nothing about it screamed danger. That was what made it worse. Maya stepped closer, drawn in despite herself. The surface of the chair revealed details that weren't visible from across the room. The texture wasn't uniform. It shifted subtly from section to section, smoother along the armrests, tighter across the back, looser near the seat where weight would naturally settle. She told herself this was normal aging, the result of use and gravity, but the explanation felt thin. The patterns in the material didn't look accidental. They looked arranged. Her eyes traced the shapes without fully naming them at first. Shallow depressions appeared where light hit at certain angles, shadowed hollows that suggested depth beneath the surface. She leaned slightly to the side, her perspective shifting, and the illusion sharpened into something more specific. These weren't random impressions, they were faces, distorted, flattened, stripped of detail, but unmistakably human in their outline. Where eyes should have been, there were empty indentations. Mouths were stretched into frozen shapes that hinted at fear or pain or something caught between the two. Maya's stomach turned. She forced herself not to look away. People nearby admired the piece openly. She heard someone comment on the brilliant craftsmanship, another person speculating about how the effect had been achieved. Latex molds maybe, custom embossing, a talented artist with a dark imagination. Maya wanted to interrupt, to tell them something was wrong, but the words stuck in her throat. She didn't know what was wrong yet, only that it was. She circled the chair slowly, her movements cautious, like approaching a wild animal that hadn't decided whether to flee or attack. The back of the chair loomed tall, its surface stretched taut over the frame. The faces there were less defined, as if time or tension had erased their features. The material caught the light in a way that made it appear almost alive, reacting subtly as the room shifted around it. Maya felt an irrational urge to apologize, a wave of discomfort so strong it bordered on guilt. When she reached the armrest, everything stopped. The tattoo sat there quietly, partially faded, its edges softened by time. A simple cross, nothing elaborate, nothing symbolic enough to be mistaken for a decorative choice. Maya stared at it, her mind scrambling for alternatives, for coincidence, for some explanation that didn't pull the past screaming into the present. Plenty of people had cross tattoos. Plenty of props borrowed familiar imagery. But this wasn't just a cross. This was his cross. She remembered it clearly, the way her uncle used to trace it with his thumb when he was nervous. The way the ink had darkened over the years. She remembered asking him once why it was so small, why he hadn't chosen something bigger. He had smiled and told her it didn't need to be big to matter. Standing in that room now, Maya felt the weight of that memory crash into her with brutal force. Her hand moved without permission. She touched the armrest lightly, just the tips of her fingers brushing the surface near the tattoo. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The material gave slightly beneath her touch, warmer than it had any right to be. It didn't resist the way leather did. It responded. Maya jerked her hand back, heart racing, breath coming too fast. She wiped her palm against her jeans as if trying to remove the sensation, but it lingered anyway, ghost-like and wrong. Her gaze snapped to the back of the chair, scanning it frantically now, no longer curious but desperate. She needed confirmation, even as she feared it. The birthmark was there, dark against the brown surface, irregular in shape, unmistakable. It sat exactly where it should, exactly where she had seen it so many times before without ever imagining it could be separated from the man it belongs to. Maya felt the room spin. The sounds of the auction rushed back all at once, too loud, too close. Her thoughts fractured, memories colliding with the present in disorienting flashes. Summer afternoons. Laughter. Her uncle lifting her onto his shoulders. The night he didn't come home. Her mother's voice on the phone, tight and shaking. 13 years of unanswered questions suddenly converging on this single, impossible moment. Marcus hadn't vanished. He had been transformed, erased, displayed. The chair loomed in front of her now as something else entirely. It wasn't furniture. It wasn't art. It was evidence. It was a body stripped of dignity and reassembled for consumption. Maya felt bile rise in her throat. She imagined all the people who must have touched it over the years, who must have sat in it, leaned back, commented on how realistic it felt. The thought made her knees weak. She stepped back, bumping into a small table behind her. Someone murmured an apology, but Maya didn't hear it. Her focus narrowed to survival, to the overwhelming need to get away from the chair, while knowing she couldn't. Leaving it felt like abandoning him all over again. Staying felt unbearable. Her scream tore out of her before she could stop it, raw and unfiltered, ripping through the careful calm of the auction preview. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. The room froze as the sound echoed off the high ceiling. Maya screamed again, her body shaking, tears spilling down her face as the truth finally broke free of her silence. In that moment, the chair ceased to be an object among many. It became the center of the room, of the story, of everything that was about to unravel. What had once passed as clever illusion revealed itself as something far darker, and Maya, standing there shaking and exposed, had become the first person willing to see it for what it truly was. Maya couldn't look away from the tattoo. Even as people began to gather behind her, even as voices overlapped in confused concern, her entire world narrowed to that small cross pressed into the armrest. It felt impossible that something so simple could carry such weight, yet it did. That mark was not decorative, it was personal. It belonged to a living, breathing man she had loved, and seeing it there flattened, faded, stripped of context felt like watching a memory being desecrated in real time. Her mind fought back instinctively, throwing up explanations that collapsed as soon as they formed. Coincidence, replication, artistic inspiration. Someone could have copied it. Someone must have copied it. But each rationalization sounded hollow, desperate, and thin. She had spent 13 years staring at old photographs, tracing that cross with her eyes in every image where her uncle's arm was visible. She knew the way one line was slightly longer than the other, the way the ink bled unevenly near the edge. No artist could have reproduced that unintentionally. No stranger could have known it mattered. Maya leaned closer despite the tremor running through her legs. Her breath came shallow, quick, like her body was preparing for impact. The tattoo wasn't stitched on or painted over the surface. It was embedded in the material itself, as if it had always been part of it. The skin around it, because her mind had begun calling it skin now, no matter how much she resisted, showed subtle variations in tone, faint scars, tiny imperfections that were horrifyingly familiar. This wasn't a replica. This was a fragment of a person, a memory surfaced uninvited. She was 12, sitting on the edge of her bed, while her uncle stood in the doorway, rolling up his sleeve to show her the tattoo again, because she had asked about it for the 100th time. He had laughed, patient as always, and told her it reminded him that he had survived things meant to break him. The thought hit her so hard she swayed, gripping the nearby table for support. Survived, he had said. The irony burned. The birthmark confirmed what her heart already knew. She stared at it, her vision tunneling, every other detail blurring out. That shape had been a constant in family stories, in gentle teasing, in affection. Her mother used to joke that she could spot Marcus in any crowd from behind because of it. Maya had believed that, had taken comfort in the idea that something about him was unmistakable, impossible to lose. Seeing it here, stripped of him, felt like proof that even the most identifying details could be stolen. Her chest tightened until breathing hurt. She stepped back again, shaking her head, as if denial might physically push the truth away. People were watching her now. She could feel their eyes, their confusion, their curiosity sharpening into concern. Someone asked if she was okay. Another voice suggested she might need air. The words washed over her without meaning. How could she explain that she was standing in front of her uncle's remains? That he had been here, hidden in plain sight, while the world moved on without him. Her scream cut through the room, raw and unfiltered, ripping the calm apart. It wasn't planned. It wasn't controlled. It came from somewhere deep, a place grief had been fermenting for years. When she screamed again, the sound echoed off the walls, and the auction preview ground to a halt. Conversations died. People froze. The chair, still and silent, sat at the center of it all. Staff rushed toward her, their faces tight with alarm. A woman in a blazer knelt beside her, asking questions too quickly. Was she hurt? Had she been injured? Maya shook her head violently, tears streaking down her face as she pointed at the chair with a trembling hand. The words wouldn't come at first. They tangled in her throat, heavy and unreal. That's my uncle, she finally managed, her voice cracking. That's him. The woman followed her gaze, brow furrowing as she took in the chair. Confusion crossed her face, then skepticism. She started to say something about props, about realism, about how upsetting these pieces could be. Maya cut her off, pushing herself to her feet with unsteady determination. Look at it, she said, her voice louder now, edged with desperation. Look at the tattoo, that cross. My uncle had that exact tattoo. He disappeared 13 years ago. And the birthmark on the back, that's his too. I've seen it my whole life. The woman hesitated, then leaned closer to the chair, studying the details. Maya watched her face change in slow, subtle ways. Confusion deepened into discomfort. The woman reached out, just as Maya had, and pressed her palm lightly against the armrest. She recoiled almost instantly. That doesn't feel right, she murmured, her voice low. Relief and terror collided in Maya's chest. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Someone else felt it too. Someone else recognized that whatever this chair was, it wasn't what it claimed to be. More staff members gathered, whispering urgently. Someone called for security. Another person mentioned calling the police. The word police cut through Maya's haze like a blade. Her phone felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she dialed her mother's number. Each ring stretched unbearably long. When her mother answered, Maya broke. The sound that came out of her was closer to a sob than speech. Mom, she gasped, you need to come here, now. What's wrong? Her mother asked, panic already creeping into her voice. Maya, are you hurt? I found him, Maya whispered, the words tasting unreal. I found Uncle Marcus. Silence followed, thick and absolute. Then her mother's voice sharpened, trembling with a hope she had learned not to trust. What do you mean you found him? His tattoo, Maya said. His birthmark, they here, on a chair, please. Just come. She ended the call before her mother could ask more questions. Before reality could catch up to the moment. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the floor, staring up at the chair that had carried her uncle through years of laughter, pain, and finally disappearance. Around her, the room buzzed with tension. People backed away, knees spreading like contagion. No one wanted to be too close anymore. As she sat there shaking, Maya thought about all the years her mother had spent searching. The flyers, the calls, The visits to shelters and hospitals. The quiet refusal to accept that Marcus had simply vanished by choice. The system had told them to move on, to accept uncertainty, to grieve without answers. And all this time, the truth had been sitting in a room people paid to be frightened in, disguised as entertainment. The tattoo remained in her line of sight, stubborn and damning. It no longer looked faded. It looked loud. It screamed what the chair could not say aloud. In that moment, Maya understood that recognizing it had changed everything. The story of Ravenhill Estate was no longer about horror as spectacle. It was about horror as concealment. And she had just torn the mask off. Sirens began to wail faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. Maya didn't look away. She stayed where she was, eyes locked on the chair, on her uncle's mark, silently promising him what she should have promised years ago, that she would not look away again, that she would not let him be hidden anymore. Maya's eyes were drawn again and again to the back of the chair, as if her mind refused to accept what it had already seen and demanded proof one more time. The birthmark sat there quietly, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its meaning. Just another irregular patch in a surface already full of unsettling detail. But to Maya, it was louder than the screams that still echoed faintly in her ears. That shape had been part of her uncle's body since before she was born. Detail so specific and so intimate that it erased the last fragile distance between doubt and certainty. She remembered the first time she'd noticed it. She had been small, trailing behind the adults at a family barbecue, bored and sticky with melted popsicle juice. Her uncle Marcus had leaned forward to light the grill, his shirt riding up just enough for the mark to show. She had pointed at it without thinking, asking what it was. Everyone had laughed, and Marcus had explained patiently that it was just something he was born with, nothing special. But later, when she was older, she realized how wrong that was. It was special because it was his. Because it made him unmistakably himself. Standing in that auction room, Maya felt something inside her fracture. Tattoos could be chosen. They could be copied. They could be explained away with effort and denial. But a birthmark was different. It was biology. It was history written into skin without permission. Seeing it there, stretched and flattened into furniture, felt like a violation so profound it left her numb. She stood up slowly, legs trembling, moving closer again, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The room seemed to lean inward as she approached, the walls pressing closer, the air thick and hard to breathe. She studied the edges of the birthmark, the subtle gradations of color, the way the surface around it puckered slightly, as if it had once been part of a body that moved and flexed. The realization hit her with a quiet, devastating force. This wasn't a single piece of material carefully preserved. This was skin taken from a living person and forced into a shape it was never meant to hold. A low sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a gasp. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heart hammer wildly beneath her ribs. Images flooded her mind unbidden. Marcus teaching her how to ride a bike, running behind her with his hands out, laughing when she fell and scraped her knee. Marcus sitting at the kitchen table late at night, sketching quietly while the rest of the house slept. Marcus pacing the living room after coming home from the military, restless, haunted, trying to outrun something only he could see. All of that life, all of that complexity, reduced to texture and surface. Someone touched her shoulder gently, and she flinched hard enough to stumble forward. The staff member murmured something apologetic, asking her to sit down, to breathe, to let them help. Maya shrugged the hand off, her gaze never leaving the chair. How could she sit when her uncle was standing, or rather, being displayed right in front of her? How could she look away now that she knew? The room had changed. She could feel it in the way people shifted uncomfortably, in the way conversations no longer resumed. The curiosity that had filled the space earlier curdled into unease. People who had once leaned in close to examine the furniture now kept their distance. A few stared openly at Maya, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. Others stared at the chair with new eyes, their expressions tightening as details they'd previously dismissed mistook on different meaning. Maya's mind raced, latching onto fragments of memory and stitching them together into a terrible clarity. The years her mother had spent searching, calling shelters, checking hospitals, filing reports that went nowhere. The dismissive responses from authorities who had suggested Marcus simply didn't want to be found. The subtle implication that a man like him struggling, drifting, visibly worn down by trauma was easier to lose, easier to write off. Rage burned beneath her shock, hot and sharp. Her mother arrived in a rush, breathless and pale, pushing through the thinning crowd as if the room itself were trying to hold her back. When she saw Maya sitting on the floor, she dropped to her knees beside her without hesitation, hands cupping her daughter's face, searching for injuries. Maya grabbed her wrists with surprising strength and pointed at the chair. There, she whispered, "Mom, look." Her mother followed her gaze slowly, cautiously, like someone approaching the edge of a cliff. She stared at the chair, at the backrest, at the mark that Maya could now see reflected in her expression, even before she spoke. The recognition was immediate and devastating. Her mother's knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Maya hadn't caught her. "That's him," her mother said hoarsely. "That's my brother." The certainty in her voice settled over the room like a verdict. Whatever doubt remained evaporated in that moment. This was no longer a distraught young woman projecting grief onto an object. This was a family recognizing their own. Maya wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her as her body shook with quiet, broken sobs. Years of restraint collapsed under the weight of proof. Her mother reached out with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the birthmark. She couldn't bring herself to make contact. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered Marcus's name over and over, as if calling him might somehow pull him back from whatever limbo he had been trapped in for so long. The staff stood frozen, unsure of what to do, their training offering no guidance for a moment like this. When the police finally arrived, the room felt suffocatingly small. Officers moved carefully, their expressions shifting as they took in the scene, as details were explained in halting, emotional bursts. A forensic specialist examined the chair more closely, her professional detachment cracking as she pressed gloved fingers against the surface. The confirmation came quietly but decisively. This was not synthetic material. This was preserved human skin. Maya watched as yellow tape was unspooled, as the auction was officially shut down, as Ravenhill Estate was reclassified from curiosity to crime scene. The chair was no longer an item with a price estimate. It was evidence. It was a body. It was her uncle. As the professionals took over, Maya found herself oddly detached, floating somewhere just outside her own body. The shock had settled into a cold, steady ache. She felt ancient, exhausted beyond measure. But beneath the grief, beneath the horror, something else took root: resolve. The birthmark had been the final key, the undeniable truth that forced the world to look where it had refused to look before. Marcus had not disappeared. He had been taken. And now that truth was exposed, it could not be ignored. Maya squeezed her mother's hand tightly, grounding herself in the warmth of a living person. A reminder of what had been lost and what still remained. The chair sat silent and immobile behind the tape, stripped of its disguise at last. For 13 years, the birthmark had been nothing more than a memory, a detail clung to in fading photographs and stories. Now it had become something else entirely: a marker of crime, a symbol of failure, and the beginning of a reckoning that would stretch far beyond room. And Maya knew, with a certainty as deep as the shock itself, that she would not let her uncle be reduced to silence again. Maya couldn't stop thinking about the way the chair had felt beneath her fingers. Even as the room filled with voices, even as staff tried to usher people back and create space, the sensation clung to her skin like a stain she couldn't wash away. It wasn't just wrong in an abstract sense. It was viscerally, unmistakably wrong. Leather had rules. It resisted. It cooled quickly. It stayed inert beneath touch. What she had felt obeyed none of those rules. Her palm tingled as if it still rested against the armrest, phantom warmth spreading through her hand and up her arm. She pressed her fingers together, rubbing them hard, trying to convince herself the memory was exaggerated by shock. But it didn't fade. The surface had yielded slightly, responding in a way no furniture ever should. Too soft, too alive, too aware. The realization made her stomach churn. When she had touched it the second time, forcing herself to do it so someone else could feel what she felt, there had been no room left for doubt. That moment replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. The staff member's hand jerking back, the flash of confusion turning into horror on her face. That shared recognition had changed the air in the room instantly. It was the moment disbelief cracked. Maya sat on the floor now, knees drawn close to her chest, watching the chair from a distance. The yellow tape hadn't gone up yet, but no one approached it anymore. The crowd had thinned, curiosity replaced by unease that crawled under people's skin and stayed there. She wondered how many of them were replaying their own memories, hands resting on armrests, fingers tracing patterns, bodies sinking into cushions, now realizing they had touched something they never consented to touch. Her mind kept circling back to the word organic. She had whispered it earlier without fully understanding why it felt so accurate. Now it echoed in her thoughts with growing clarity. Organic meant once living. It meant cellular structure, temperature retention, subtle elasticity. It meant the thing she touched had not always been an object. It meant it had memory. She thought about how the chair had seemed warmer than the rest of the room. At the time, she dismissed it as imagination, or maybe the way light fell through the windows. Now she wondered if it had absorbed warmth from countless bodies over the years, holding onto it the way flesh does. The idea made her gag quietly, her throat tightening as she leaned forward and breathed through the nausea. Her mother sat beside her, silent now, one hand gripping Maya's shoulder with quiet ferocity, as if anchoring her to the floor. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Words felt too small, too fragile to carry the truth they now shared. Maya could feel her mother trembling, the shock still rippling through her body in uneven waves. When the first forensic technician arrived, Maya watched closely, desperate for confirmation, even though she already had it. The woman approached the chair with professional caution, slipping on gloves, examining the surface under portable lights. She pressed gently against the armrest, the same spot Maya had touched. Her fingers paused, then pressed again, more deliberately. The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This isn't animal hide," she said quietly to the officer beside her. "And it's not synthetic." Hearing it out loud sent a cold rush through Maya's chest. She had known. She had known the moment her fingers made contact. But hearing someone else say it, someone trained, someone objective, made it real in a way that stole her breath. This wasn't grief speaking. This wasn't hysteria. This was fact. The technician described the texture in careful, clinical language: unusual elasticity, heat retention inconsistent with treated leather, micro variations in thickness. She spoke as if reciting data points, but Maya could hear the strain beneath the professionalism. This wasn't something the woman encountered often. This wasn't something anyone should encounter. Maya closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by a sudden, intrusive thought. Her uncle's skin had once protected him from the world. It had held in warmth on cold nights, borne the scars of his life, stretched and healed and aged with him. And now it had been stripped of all that purpose, reduced to surface and function, made to bear weight without consent. The cruelty of it felt endless. She thought about all the times Marcus had complained about the cold after coming back from overseas, about how he used to sit close to space heaters or wrap himself in blankets, even in mild weather. He had always been sensitive to temperature changes. The irony cut deep. His skin, now preserved and repurposed, still reacted to warmth, still remembered what it was to be alive. Maya opened her eyes again and looked at the chair with new clarity. It no longer resembled furniture at all. The curves of the frame looked like restraints. The stretched surface looked like forced compliance. Every seam where pieces met felt intentional, violent in its precision. She wondered how much time it had taken, how methodical the process must have been, How much suffering was compressed into something people once described as beautifully made. Her breathing quickened as anger began to edge out the shock. This hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a moment of madness. Whoever did this had planned it. Had learned how to treat human tissue, how to preserve it, how to disguise it well enough that even experts missed it. The thought made her hands clench into fists. She remembered how people used to talk about Ravenhill Estate with admiration. How they praised the realism, the craftsmanship, the dedication to detail. She remembered overhearing conversations about how the place felt different, how it left people unsettled long after they left. No one had thought to question why. They had accepted the discomfort as part of the experience. Maya felt a surge of bitter clarity. The truth had been there all along, hiding behind praise. As officers began to photograph the chair and cordon off the area, Maya felt herself drifting again. Her mind struggling to keep up with the speed at which her world had changed. Just hours earlier, she had walked into the estate as an observer, a curious bystander. Now she was the center of something much larger, something that would unravel years of carefully hidden crimes. Her hands still felt wrong. She flexed her fingers slowly, watching them move as if they belonged to someone else. The memory of the texture lingered with unnatural persistence, a sensory imprint she doubted would ever fully fade. It wasn't just the knowledge of what she had touched. It was the betrayal of the senses themselves. Her own body had recognized the truth before her mind did. Maya leaned into her mother's side, exhausted. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her, heavy and relentless. She understood now that this moment, the realization that the chair was not leather, not fabric, not imitation, was the point of no return. Everything before it had been uncertainty. Everything after it would be consequence. The room around her continued to shift as authority replaced confusion, as procedures took over where disbelief had been. But Maya remained fixed in that single, horrifying certainty. She had touched her uncle. Not as he was, not as he should have been remembered, but as he had been turned into. And that truth, once felt, could never be unfelt. The decision to call the police came to Maya with a strange, icy clarity. It wasn't dramatic or panicked the way people imagine moments like that should be. It was quiet, almost procedural, as if some deeper part of her understood that whatever came next was no longer something she or her family could carry alone. This was bigger than grief, bigger than shock, bigger than a single chair in a single room. If she didn't act now, if she hesitated even a moment longer, the truth might slip back into silence the way it had 13 years ago. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she stood up, legs unsteady, her mother still clinging to her arm. The room buzzed with low, nervous voices. Auction staff spoke in hushed tones near the entrance. A few remaining visitors lingered at the edges, torn between curiosity and the instinct to flee. No one knew what to do with a horror that refused to stay fictional. Maya stepped slightly away from the chair, forcing herself to create distance without turning her back on it. She dialed 911 with fingers that barely obeyed her. When the operator answered, the normalcy of the voice on the other end nearly broke her. There was something obscene about how ordinary the moment sounded. Location, emergency, was anyone injured? Maya swallowed hard, struggling to compress the impossible into words that would make sense. There's human remains, she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. At an estate auction. I believe a piece of furniture is made from human skin. There was a pause, long enough for doubt to creep in. The operator asked her to repeat herself. Maya did, slower this time, grounding herself in facts: a chair, a tattoo, a birthmark, a missing person report filed 13 years ago. She heard the shift in tone immediately. The calm professionalism sharpened. She was asked to stay on the line, to keep others away from the object, to ensure no one touched anything further. Maya hung up and relayed the instructions to the nearest staff member, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. To their credit, they listened. Whatever skepticism they might have held earlier had dissolved. Too many things no longer added up. The room took on a different energy as people were asked to leave, as doors were closed, as the auction preview was quietly but decisively shut down. The house seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for years. As they waited, time warped. Minutes stretched into something amorphous and unreal. Maya sank back onto the floor beside her mother, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight. She felt hollowed out, emptied by the sheer force of what she had uncovered. Her thoughts drifted unwillingly to the idea that if she hadn't come today, if she had listened to the voice that told her to stay away, this chair might have been sold, shipped, hidden again. Her uncle could have disappeared a second time. She stared at the chair from across the room, now isolated, watched over by a nervous security guard who kept his distance. It looked smaller somehow without the crowd around it, less powerful now that its secret was exposed. And yet, the horror of it felt more concentrated than ever. This thing had lived among people. It had passed inspections, appraisals, admiration. It had been normalized. That realization sat heavier on her chest than the initial shock. Her mother broke the silence with a whisper. "They didn't listen," she said, not looking at Maya. "All those years. They didn't listen." Maya squeezed her hand, understanding without needing clarification. The reports, the calls, the polite dismissals. The assumptions made about a man who had fallen through the cracks of systems that were supposed to catch him. Anger flared again, sharper this time, no longer directionless. The police were coming now, but they were late. They had always been late. When the first patrol cars arrived, the sound of sirens cut through the stillness like a blade. Maya flinched instinctively, her heart jumping despite herself. Officers entered cautiously, their expressions neutral but alert. They listened as Maya explained, as her mother filled in the years of absence, as staff recounted what had happened since the discovery. No one laughed, no one dismissed it. The chair spoke for itself now. A detective arrived shortly after, older, measured, his eyes taking in the room with practiced efficiency. He didn't rush. He asked careful questions. He knelt to examine the chair without touching it, studying the tattoo, the birthmark, the seams. Maya watched him closely, searching his face for signs of disbelief. Instead, she saw something else: unease. He ordered the area sealed. The words "crime scene" rippled through the space with a strange finality. Yellow tape went up, dividing before from after. The auction staff stood together in stunned silence, their earlier excitement replaced by shock and dawning comprehension. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't bad publicity. This was a crime that had been hiding in plain sight. As more officers arrived, the house filled with a different kind of movement, measured, controlled, purposeful. Evidence bags appeared. Cameras clicked. Notes were taken. Maya felt herself receding again, her role shifting from discoverer to witness. She answered questions when asked, repeating details until her voice felt raw. Each repetition made the truth more solid, harder to deny. The detective asked about her uncle, his name, his age, when he was last seen. Maya watched her mother answer, voice steady through sheer force of will. 13 years collapsed into a few sentences. It felt grotesque to compress a life that way, but Maya understood the necessity. This was how systems worked. This was how stories were entered into records. When the detective finally told them they needed to leave the property, Maya felt an unexpected surge of resistance. Leaving felt wrong. Like abandonment. She looked at the chair one last time, memorizing it, committing every detail to memory as if afraid it might vanish the moment she turned away. She wanted to promise something, though she wasn't sure what. Just as truth. Exposure. All of it felt inadequate. Outside, the late afternoon had slipped into early evening. The sky was dimming, shadows lengthening across the lawn. Police lights flashed red and blue against the aging facade of the house, transforming it into something stark and unmistakable. Maya stood beside her mother, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching as professionals took over what she had started. She realized then that calling the police hadn't been the end of anything. It was the beginning. The moment the story stopped belonging solely to her family and started demanding answers from a world that had ignored them. The chair would not be hidden again. The house would not be dismissed as a curiosity. And her uncle would not be reduced to a footnote. Maya exhaled slowly, the weight of the day settling into her bones. She had come to an auction out of idle curiosity. She was leaving as the person who had forced the truth into the open. Whatever came next, investigations, headlines, grief that would deepen before it eased, she knew one thing with certainty. Silence was no longer an option. Denise Robinson arrived at Ravenhill Estate with her heart already racing, the drive a blur she barely remembered. Maya's call had been fragmented, panicked but controlled in a way that frightened her more than hysteria ever could. There were words she couldn't shake, found him, tattoo, chair phrases that made no sense, and yet carried a weight Denise recognized instantly. 13 years of searching had trained her to hear danger in tone alone. By the time she pushed through the doors of the mansion, she already knew something irrevocable had happened. The interior hit her like a wall. The air was heavy, stale, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with fear as entertainment. People stood clustered near the walls, subdued, avoiding eye contact. Yellow tape had not yet gone up, but the room felt divided all the same before and after, ignorance and knowing. Denise spotted Maya sitting on the floor near the center of the parlor, her shoulders hunched, her face pale and streaked with tears. Denise crossed the room without hesitation, dropping to her knees and pulling her daughter into her arms. "Baby," she whispered, scanning Maya for injuries, her hands shaking as she cupped her face. "Are you hurt?" Maya shook her head, gripping Denise's wrists with a strength that startled her. She didn't cry now. Her eyes were locked on something behind Denise, fixed and unblinking. "Mom," she said quietly. "Look." Denise turned slowly, following her daughter's gaze. The chair sat against the far wall, isolated by a widening circle of space, as if the room itself refused to go near it. At first, Denise saw only what anyone would see, an old armchair, dark wood, edged upholstery, something vaguely grotesque in its design. She took a step forward, then stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The tattoo was the first thing she recognized. Not because it was dramatic or prominent, but because it was intimate. A small cross, slightly crooked, faded just so. Denise had stood beside her brother in a tattoo shop decades ago, holding his hand while he pretended not to be nervous. She had teased him about choosing something so plain. He had smiled and told her it wasn't about how it looked. It was about what it meant. Seeing it there, pressed into the surface of a chair, stripped of context and dignity, felt like being struck. Her knees weakened. Denise gripped the back of a nearby table to steady herself, her vision narrowing. "No," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was speaking to. "No, no, no." Her eyes lifted to the back of the chair, and the last thread of denial snapped. The birthmark sat there unmistakably, its irregular shape as familiar to her as her own reflection. She had known it since the day her brother was born, had kissed it when he was small, had joked about it when they were teenagers. It was not something anyone could invent. It was not something anyone could mistake. "That's him," Denise said, her voice breaking as the words forced their way out. "That's my brother." The sound that followed wasn't a scream. It was lower, roar, pulled from somewhere deep and animal. Denise folded in on herself, grief crashing over her in a wave so sudden and violent it stole her breath. Maya caught her as she collapsed, holding her upright as Denise sobbed into her shoulder. 13 years of restraint, of controlled hope and quiet despair, disintegrated in seconds. Around them, the room went utterly still. Staff members who had been hovering froze where they stood. A few people turned away, unable to watch. Denise clung to Maya, her body shaking as she whispered her brother's name over and over, as if repetition might bring him back. As if saying it aloud could somehow reverse what her eyes were telling her. "I knew," she gasped between sobs. "I knew he didn't just leave. I told them. I told everyone." Maya held her tighter, her own tears returning silently. She had heard those words her entire life, spoken in frustration, in quiet conviction, in moments when hope threatened to flicker out. Denise had never accepted the explanations offered to her. She had never believed her brother would disappear without a word. Standing here now, surrounded by proof too terrible to deny, the validation felt hollow, cruel. Denise pulled back suddenly, wiping her face with trembling hands. She stood and took a step toward the chair, then another, as if drawn by something stronger than fear. She stopped just short of touching it. Her hand hovered inches away from the birthmark, fingers shaking violently. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Marcus." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried. It cut through the room in a way nothing else had. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't hysteria. This was recognition, familial and absolute. The chair was no longer an object under consideration. It was a body. It was evidence of a crime that had been ignored, dismissed, buried under assumptions about who mattered enough to be searched for. Denise turned to the people watching, her grief sharpening into something harder. "We reported him missing," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "The day he disappeared. I called shelters, hospitals. I went to police stations until they stopped returning my calls. They told me he was an adult. They told me people like him drift. They told me to move on." Her gaze returned to the chair. "He didn't drift," she said. "He was taken." The words settled heavily in the air. Someone quietly stepped away, pressing a hand to their mouth. Another staff member nodded faintly, as if finally understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding. Denise sank back down beside Maya, exhaustion overtaking her now that the truth was undeniable. She leaned into her daughter, their heads touching, sharing the weight of a grief that had finally been given a shape. When the police entered the room moments later, Denise lifted her head, eyes red but focused. She answered questions calmly, precisely recounting details she had repeated for years without anyone listening. Dates, locations, Marcus's age, his struggles after returning from the military. The detective listened carefully, his expression tightening as Denise spoke. This time no one interrupted her. No one suggested alternative explanations. As the officers examined the chair, Denise watched closely, her body tense. When one of them flinched at the texture beneath a gloved hand, Denise felt a grim confirmation settle in her chest. She closed her eyes briefly, bracing herself, then opened them again. She would not look away. She had spent too long being told not to see. By the time the room was officially declared a crime scene, Denise felt strangely calm. The storm had already passed through her. What remained was grief, yes, but also something else, an iron resolve she hadn't felt in years. Her brother had been hidden. He had been used. He had been reduced to an object. That would not be the end of his story. As she and Maya were escorted outside, Denise glanced back one last time at the chair, now cordoned off, stripped of its false identity. "I found you," she whispered under her breath. "I didn't stop looking." For the first time in 13 years, the words felt true in a way that hurt almost as much as it healed. The shift from confusion to control happened quickly, but not quietly. Once the detective made the decision, the atmosphere inside Ravenhill Estate changed in a way that was almost physical, like a pressure drop before a storm. Radios crackled to life, voices sharpened, movements became precise. What had been an auction preview moments earlier was stripped of that identity piece by piece. The word auction stopped meaning anything at all. Uniformed officers moved through the mansion methodically, clearing rooms and guiding the remaining visitors toward the exits. No one argued. No one complained. Whatever curiosity had brought them, they dissolved under the weight of what had been revealed. People left in silence, some with pale faces, others with eyes fixed straight ahead as if afraid that looking back would somehow implicate them. A few glanced over their shoulders at the parlor one last time, at the chair now sitting alone, and quickly looked away. Outside, patrol cars lined the street, lights flashing but sirens silent, bathing the aging facade of the estate in red and blue. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering to one another, trying to piece together what was happening. Rumors spread faster than fabrics ever body, a murder, a hoax. No one yet understood the scale of it, only that something terrible had surfaced behind those walls. Inside, yellow tape was unspooled and stretched across doorways, hallways, staircases. Each strip marked a boundary, a declaration that whatever lay beyond was no longer accessible, no longer neutral. Crime scene. The words carried weight, finality. They transformed the house from curiosity to evidence, from attraction to accusation. Maya watched from the edge of the parlor as the tape went up, her mother beside her, both of them wrapped in shock and exhaustion. She felt oddly detached, as if she were watching the aftermath of something that had happened to someone else. The estate looked smaller now, its grandeur reduced by fluorescent lights and procedural efficiency. The illusion Ravenhill had depended on mystery darkness. Performance collapsed under scrutiny. The detective issued clear instructions. No one was to touch anything. No items were to be moved. Every piece of furniture, every object, every surface was now potential evidence. The auction staff listened, stunned, nodding mechanically as they absorbed the reality of what this meant. Their carefully prepared catalogs, their estimated values, their plans for bidding and sales all became meaningless in an instant. One of the staff members, a middle-aged man who had spent days appraising the estate, stared at the chair with hollow eyes. "I sat in that," he murmured, almost to himself. No one responded. There was nothing to say that could lessen the impact of that realization. As officers fanned out through the house, the scale of the operation expanded. Each room was photographed. Notes were taken. Doors were labeled. The basement entrance was blocked off until additional personnel arrived. The house resisted none of it. It stood quietly, as if resigned to finally being seen for what it was. Maya felt a flicker of grim satisfaction watching the process unfold. For years, her family had begged for attention, for investigation, for someone to take Marcus's disappearance seriously. Now the house that had hidden him was being calmed inch by inch, its secrets forced into the light. The irony was sharp enough to hurt. It shouldn't have taken this. It shouldn't have required something so grotesque to trigger action. Her mother sat heavily on a folding chair an officer had brought for her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than Maya had ever seen her, worn down by grief finally given a form. Maya stood beside her, acting as a barrier between her and the rest of the room, her body instinctively protective. When the detective returned to them, his tone was calm but firm. He explained that the auction was officially cancelled, indefinitely. The estate was now under full police control. No items would leave the property. No one would be allowed back inside without authorization. A forensic team was already en route. Denise nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "You'll investigate everything?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with something sharp. "Yes, ma'am," the detective said. "Everything." That single word carried more reassurance than any apology ever could. The announcement rippled outward quickly. The auction house representatives made calls, their voices hushed and urgent. The executor was notified. Lawyers would follow, insurance companies, city officials. The machinery of consequence had been set in motion, grinding forward with a momentum that could not be stopped. Maya stepped closer to the doorway and looked back at the parlor one last time. The chair was now partially obscured by tape and personnel, its details harder to make out from where she stood. Somehow that felt worse. She had seen it clearly once. She didn't need to see it again to know what it was. As they were escorted outside, the cool evening air hit her like a shock. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the scent of grass and pavement and exhaust ordinary things, alive things. The contrast made her dizzy. Behind her, the doors of Ravenhill Estate closed with a dull, final sound, sealing the truth inside with the investigators who would soon begin to dismantle it piece by piece. Reporters hadn't arrived yet, but Maya knew they would. The story was too strange, too horrifying to stay contained. She could already imagine the headlines, the speculation, the public outrage. Part of her recoiled at the thought. Another part welcomed it. Silence had protected what happened here for far too long. She watched as an officer posted a notice near the gate, informing the public that the property was closed pending investigation. People across the street craned their necks to read it, murmurs rising again. Maya felt strangely removed from them, as if she had crossed into a different reality where the rules no longer applied. Her mother squeezed her hand. "It's real now," Denise said quietly. Maya nodded. It was real in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The cancellation of the auction wasn't just a logistical decision. It was a rupture. It marked the moment when Ravenhill Estates stopped being a place people paid to be frightened and became a place where fear had been manufactured from stolen lives. As the police lights continued to flash against the darkening sky, Maya understood that what she had uncovered could not be put back. The house had been sealed, but the truth had already escaped. And for the first time since her uncle disappeared, the system that had once told them to let go was being forced to pay attention. The confirmation came slowly, deliberately, stripped of drama and delivered in a tone that made it impossible to dismiss. The forensic team worked with the careful patience of people who already understood that what they were about to uncover would not be undone by disbelief. Portable lights were set up around the chair, casting harsh illumination over every seam, every irregularity in the surface. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood, the sterile edge of procedure colliding with the rot of what had been hidden there for years. Maya and her mother were asked to sit a short distance away, close enough to hear, but far enough to be shielded from the worst of the process. Maya watched everything anyway. She needed to. Turning away felt like another form of abandonment, and she had already lived with that guilt for too long. Her fingers were laced tightly together in her lap, knuckles white, as the medical examiner began explaining what they were seeing. The gloves came first. Latex snapped softly against skin, then tools, small, precise instruments designed for delicacy rather than force. A sample was taken from the armrest, barely visible to the untrained eye. Another from the backrest, near the birthmark. Each movement was careful, respectful in a way that contrasted violently with what had been done to create the object in the first place. "This is preserved organic material," the examiner said, her voice calm but weighted. "Human tissue." The words landed heavily, final and absolute. No one spoke. Even the officers seemed to hold their breath. Maya felt her mother's hand tighten around hers, nails pressing into skin. It hurt, but she welcomed it. Pain anchored her in the moment. The examiner continued, explaining the preservation process in clinical terms. Chemical treatment, controlled drying, techniques designed to maintain flexibility and prevent decay. It wasn't crude work. It was methodical, practiced, informed by knowledge of anatomy and chemistry. Whoever had done this hadn't improvised. They had learned. They had refined their methods over time. Maya felt a surge of nausea at that realization. This wasn't a single act of madness. It was a system, a routine. Something repeated often enough to become efficient. The thought that her uncle's body had been handled with such detached expertise made her stomach churn. "It's not just one individual," the examiner added quietly. "There are variations in texture, pigmentation, thickness, multiple sources." That was when the room seemed to tilt. Maya's breath caught sharply in her chest. Multiple sources. The words echoed in her head, refusing to settle. She had known, intellectually, that this was possible, even likely, but hearing it spoken aloud tore open something raw and bleeding inside her. Her uncle wasn't alone in this horror. He never had been. The detective asked for clarification, his voice low. The examiner nodded, gesturing toward the seams where different sections of the upholstery met. "These joins aren't decorative. They're functional." The material was assembled from different pieces to fit the frame. At least 3 individuals are represented in this single chair. Denise made a sound that didn't resemble any word. Maya turned toward her mother instinctively, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as Denise folded inward. Grief crashing through her in waves too heavy to hold back. The idea that Marcus's remains had been stitched together with parts of other people, strangers who had suffered their own quiet disappearances, was unbearable. The violation felt endless, layered, multiplying the pain rather than dividing it. The examiner went on, gently but relentlessly thorough. The faces pressed into the upholstery were not sculpted impressions. They were real, flattened and preserved, their features distorted by process and time but still identifiable as human. Eye sockets, mouths, cheekbones. The craftsmanship that visitors had once admired was revealed for what it truly was, an arrangement of stolen lives forced into stillness. Maya felt cold spread through her limbs, a creeping numbness that threatened to shut her down entirely. She focused on breathing, on the sound of her own lungs filling and emptying, grounding herself in the present. This was happening. This was real. And she needed to stay conscious, stay present, for her uncle if nothing else. The confirmation rippled outward quickly. Officers exchanged looks, their professionalism strained by the magnitude of what they were uncovering. Radios crackled again, summoning additional resources. This was no longer a single homicide investigation. It was something far larger, something that would reach back years, possibly decades. The chair was carefully photographed from every angle, each detail documented with an attention that felt almost reverent now that its true nature was known. Evidence markers were placed, notes were taken. Maya watched the process with a strange mixture of horror and relief. At least now, the chair was being treated as what it was. At least now, it was no longer being appraised for value. The examiner approached Maya and Denise afterward, kneeling slightly to meet them at a eye level. Her voice softened. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I know this isn't how you wanted answers." Denise nodded faintly, unable to speak. Maya swallowed hard and forced herself to ask the question burning in her chest. "You're sure?" Her voice shook. "There's no mistake?" The examiner met her gaze without hesitation. "I'm sure." That certainty settled over Maya like a weight and a release all at once. The last fragments of doubt dissolved. What remained was grief in its purest form, pain sharpened by truth, by finality. Marcus was gone. He had been gone for a long time. And the way he had been taken was more monstrous than anything Maya had imagined during all the years of not knowing. As the forensic team packed up their initial equipment and prepared for a more extensive examination of the house, Maya stared at the chair one last time before it was covered and secured. It looked smaller now, diminished by exposure, stripped of the mystique that had once protected it. It was no longer powerful. It was evidence of cruelty, nothing more. Her mind drifted unwillingly to the other victims, the ones whose names she didn't know yet. People who had vanished quietly, whose absence hadn't sparked years of searching or desperate phone calls. People who had been consumed by the same system that failed her uncle, rendered invisible long before they were taken. The thought filled her with a deep, simmering anger that steadied her even as grief threatened to drown her. Denise stood slowly, wiping her face with trembling hands. She looked older now, as if the years had finally caught up to her all at once. But there was something else in her posture, too, an iron resolve Maya recognized instantly. The searching was over. The fight was not. As they were escorted from the room, Maya felt the full weight of what the confirmation meant. This wasn't just closure. It was exposure. The truth would demand accountability, not just for whoever had done this, but for every system that had allowed it to continue unnoticed for so long. The chair remained behind them, wrapped and marked, no longer an object of fascination but a silent witness. And Maya understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of grief, that the confirmation of what it was had changed everything. There would be no going back to ignorance, no retreat into comforting uncertainty. The horror had been named, measured, and acknowledged, and now it would have to be answered. The scope of the horror revealed itself gradually, not in a single shocking announcement, but through a steady accumulation of evidence that grew heavier with every passing hour. Once the forensic team moved beyond the chair and began examining the rest of the contents of Ravenhill Estate, a grim pattern emerged, one that made it impossible to view any object in the house as neutral or harmless again. Tables, ottomans, lamps, benches, decorative fixtures that had once been admired for their creativity were now approached with gloved hands and grim expectation. Maya and her mother were moved to a nearby waiting area, but updates reached them regularly, carried by detectives whose faces grew more drawn each time they returned. The first discovery beyond the chair was an upholstered footstool in an upstairs room. Rays revealed irregular internal density inconsistent with wood or foam. Tissue samples confirmed what everyone now feared: human material, preserved, treated, incorporated with intent. What had once been an isolated nightmare became something systemic. By nightfall, the number had climbed steadily. a settee in the hallway, a tall backed throne used as a centerpiece attraction, a reading chair positioned near what used to be a stage torture room. Each one told the same story through different configurations of cruelty. Some pieces were constructed from a single individual, their remains stretched and repurposed to cover a frame. Others were patchworks multiple people stitched together with unsettling precision, their skin tones subtly different where seams met, their features arranged like macabre design elements. When the lead investigator finally sat down across from Maya and Denise, his expression was one of controlled gravity. He didn't rush. He didn't soften the truth. He told them plainly that 15 separate pieces of furniture throughout the estate contained preserved human remains. Not props, not imitations, bodies, transformed into objects and displayed for years. Denise closed her eyes, inhaling sharply, as if bracing for physical impact. Maya felt her pulse roar in her ears. 15. The number echoed, too large to process all at once, too heavy to comprehend. She had been preparing herself for the possibility of others. But knowing and understanding were very different things. This wasn't a single victim hidden in plain sight. It was a collection. The investigator continued, explaining that the furniture varied in construction and age, suggesting the practice had occurred over a long period of time. Some pieces showed signs of older preservation methods, while others reflected improvements made through repetition. The timeline stretched back years, possibly decades. Ravenhill Estate hadn't simply housed a crime. It had been built around it. Maya imagined the house as it must have been when it first opened, the early pieces already in place. The process still experimental. Visitors had praised the realism even then, unaware that they were responding to something their bodies recognized before their minds did. Over time, the collection had grown, evolving alongside the attraction, feeding into its reputation. The horror had been cumulative, layered carefully beneath spectacle. Forensic estimates suggested at least 21 individual victims represented across the 15 pieces. Some identities would take time to confirm. Day testing was underway, but degradation and chemical treatment complicated the process. Still, enough markers remained to make identification possible. The investigator emphasized this gently, as if offering a fragile thread of justice in the midst of devastation. Maya's thoughts drifted to the lives behind the number. 21 people. 21 absences. 21 families who had waited, hoped, searched, and eventually been told to accept silence. She wondered how many of them had been dismissed the way her uncle had been, categorized as transient, unstable, expendable. The rage that rose in her chest was sharp and clarifying. Denise spoke then, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "You were going to identify them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," the investigator replied, "everyone we can." The assurance mattered. It didn't heal anything, but it mattered. For years, Denise had begged for that kind of commitment. To hear it now, backed by evidence too horrific to ignore, was both vindication and heartbreak. As the investigation continued, Maya was allowed to see photographs taken by the forensic team, carefully framed. Clinical images meant to document, not sensationalize. She hesitated before looking, but she needed to understand the scale of what had been done. An ottoman assembled from 2 different skin tones. A dining chair whose armrests bore flattened facial features, mouths pulled into permanent silence. A lamp shade so thin it glowed when light passed through it, revealing organic texture beneath the surface. Each image stripped away another layer of disbelief. The house had not been decorated. It had been constructed from people. Maya thought about the thousands of visitors who had walked through Ravenhill Estate over the years. The laughter, the screams, the casual touch of hands against furniture as people leaned, rested, posed for photos. None of them had known. Most of them had never questioned why the horror felt so different here. The realization made her feel sick. This wasn't just murder. It was exploitation on a massive scale, suffering repackaged as entertainment. The detective explained that the discovery would likely expand further. Every item in the estate was now under suspicion. Even pieces that appeared purely structural: coat racks, decorative frames, Architectural accents were being examined. The number 15 was not final. It was simply where they stood now. Night settled over the estate, but the work continued. Floodlights illuminated the house from outside. Inside, teams rotated through rooms, documenting, sampling, cataloging what had once been cataloged for sale. The transformation was stark. Where value had once been assigned, now there was only evidence. Maya sat with her mother in silence, exhaustion pressing down on both of them. At some point, the shock gave way to a cold, focused resolve. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It never had been. He was one of many, and that truth demanded more than private mourning. Denise reached for Maya's hand, squeezing it firmly. "We won't let them disappear again," she said quietly. Maya nodded. The 15 pieces of furniture were no longer objects. They were testimonies. Proof of what happens when people are deemed invisible. When horror is allowed to hide behind aesthetics. When silence becomes complicity. Ravenhill Estate had been designed to scare people for profit. Instead, it had become a ledger of stolen lives. And as the count grew, one truth became unavoidable: this was not an anomaly. It was a warning. The identities began to surface not as names at first, but as patterns. The forensic reports, missing person databases, and preliminary den results formed a grim mosaic that revealed who the victims were long before their faces or histories were fully recovered. They were overwhelmingly people society had learned not to see: men and women of color. People who had slipped into homelessness after losing jobs, families, health, or stability. Veterans whose service ended without support. Individuals struggling with untreated mental illness. Young adults who had aged out of systems meant to protect them, and found nothing waiting on the other side. Each discovery peeled back another layer of the same uncomfortable truth. Maya listened as investigators explained what they were finding, her body heavy with exhaustion and grief. Every confirmed detail felt like a tightening knot. The victims had disappeared over a span of years, not all at once, not in a way that triggered alarms. Their cases were scattered across time, their absences small enough individually to be overlooked. But together, they formed a devastating pattern of neglect. These were people whose disappearances had been filed, noted, and quietly deprioritized. The detective spoke carefully, choosing his words with an awareness that each one carried weight. All confirmed victims so far were African American. All had been adults at the time they vanished, ranging from late teens to middle age. Most had been unhoused or living precariously when they disappeared. Several had documented mental health conditions. A few were veterans. Every single case had been reported, and nearly every investigation had stalled within weeks. Denise closed her eyes as she listened, her face drawn tight with a pain that went deeper than personal loss. She had lived this reality. She had heard the subtle shifts in tone when she spoke to police, the way urgency drained from their voices once they learned her brother didn't fit the profile of someone considered high priority. Maya felt anger burn behind her ribs, hot and relentless. This wasn't just about one man exploiting vulnerability. It was about a system that made exploitation easy. Maya thought about how often the word transient appeared in reports, how quickly assumptions were made, how easily absence was explained away. People move, people start over, people don't want to be found. Those narratives were convenient. They required no follow-up, no resources, no accountability. And they created the perfect conditions for someone watching closely, someone willing to take advantage of invisibility. The more details emerged, the clearer the selection process became. The victims had not been random. They had been chosen precisely because their lives intersected with institutional failure. They lived in the margins, where records were thin and concern was conditional. They were seen as complicated cases, not urgent ones. The house had not just hidden bodies, it had hidden them behind bias. For Maya, the realization landed with a bitter familiarity. Her uncle had not disappeared into thin air. He had disappeared into a category: veteran, unhoused, adult male. The assumptions stacked quickly, efficiently, until the need to look harder evaporated. The same thing had happened to the others. Different names, same outcome. The investigators explained that cross Referencing was underway with decades of missing person reports from the region. Some families had never stopped searching. Others had been forced to grieve without confirmation, trapped in a purgatory of not knowing. A few cases had been closed so long ago that next of kin had moved, aged, died. The work of identification would be slow and painful, but it would be done. That promise mattered, even if it came too late. Maya wondered about the lives behind the files. She imagined a young woman who left home after aging out of foster care, believing she would figure things out somehow. A man who slept under a bridge after his disability check stopped covering rent. A veteran who came home with nightmares and found no place to put them. She imagined birthdays missed, phone calls that never came, holidays marked by an empty chair that no one could explain. Each life carried a history that had been reduced to a line item in a report. The investigator admitted what Maya already suspected. If even one of these victims had come from a different background, stable housing, consistent employment, strong institutional advocacy, the pattern might have been interrupted sooner. Someone might have noticed. Someone might have asked harder questions. Instead, the disappearances blended into a background noise society had learned to tune out. Denai spoke quietly then, her voice steady but edged with quiet fury. They mattered, she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement. Every one of them. The room fell silent for a moment. The detective nodded. Yes, he said, they did. For Maya, that acknowledgement felt both validating and devastating. Words alone couldn't undo what had been allowed to happen. But they mattered because they named the truth that had been avoided for so long. These victims were not anonymous. They were not disposable. They were not inevitable losses. They were people who had been failed repeatedly before they were taken, and after they were gone. As more details surfaced, the narrative shifted. This was no longer a story about a monstrous individual acting alone. It was about opportunity created by indifference. The house had not existed in a vacuum. It had operated within a society that sorted lives by perceived worth, that rationed attention and urgency based on stability and status. The horror had been hidden in plain sight, because too many people had been trained not to look closely at who was missing. Maya felt a deep, aching resolve settle in her chest. She couldn't bring her uncle back. She couldn't undo the years of suffering endured by the others. But she could refuse to let the story end here, framed only by spectacle and shock. The truth demanded more than outrage. It demanded change. As the list of victims grew, Maya realized that remembering them would require effort. Their names would not be familiar to the public. Their stories would not be widely known unless someone insisted on telling them. That responsibility felt heavy, but also necessary. Visibility, she understood now, was not automatic. It had to be fought for. Late that night, as she sat beside her mother in a quiet room away from the chaos of the investigation, Maya stared at the wall and thought about how many people walk past the vulnerable every day without seeing them. How easy it is to accept absence as normal when the world teaches you who is allowed to vanish. The knowledge settled into her bones, uncomfortable and undeniable. The victims had been chosen because they were easy to overlook. The reckoning that followed would be about refusing to do that ever again. The journals were found in the basement, hidden not behind a false wall or locked door, but stacked neatly on a metal worktable, as if their author had always assumed they would one day be read. That detail unsettled the investigators more than any attempt at concealment might have. There was no panic in the way they were stored, no urgency, just order. Each notebook was labeled by year in careful, precise handwriting, the ink unsmudged, the pages protected from moisture and dust. Whoever had written them had not feared discovery. He had anticipated it. When the detective informed Maya and her mother that journals had been recovered, the words barely registered at first. Evidence already surrounded them in overwhelming volume. Furniture, forensic reports, names emerging from databases. But when he explained that the journals detailed the creation of the furniture, the methods, the victims, the intent, Maya felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This wasn't just proof of what had been done. It was proof of how deliberately it had been done. They were brought into a quiet room away from the main investigation, the photocopied pages laid out on a long table. The originals had already been secured as evidence, sealed away, but the copies were more than enough. Maya hesitated before touching them. The paper felt ordinary beneath her fingers, a mundane contrast to the violence it contained. Denai sat beside her, back straight, jaw clenched, bracing herself. The first entry began without preamble. No confession, no hesitation, just documentation. The language was clinical, almost academic, stripped of emotion. It read like lab notes, observations recorded by someone invested in process rather than consequence. The writer referred to people as subjects, described encounters as acquisitions, and framed murder as methodology. Maya felt sick as she read, a slow, burning horror spreading through her body. The entries detailed how victims were approached, where they were found, what offers were made: food, temporary work, shelter. Kindness weaponized with precision. The writer noted patterns, preferences, adjustments over time. He wrote about learning which locations offered the least resistance, which promises inspired trust, which hours of the day drew the most vulnerable. There was no chaos in it. It was systematic. Denai let out a low sound as she read, something between a sob and a growl. Maya reached for her hand, grounding both of them as the words continued. The journals didn't just recount the killings. They celebrated the results. The writer described the preservation process with disturbing pride, detailing chemical treatments and techniques borrowed from historical tanning practices, refined through experimentation. Failures were noted dispassionately. Improvements were recorded with satisfaction. One entry mentioned visitors reacting to a new piece of furniture during a Halloween season, praising its realism, commenting on how unsettling it felt. The writer had underlined a sentence in that passage, adding a note in the margin: authenticity produces the strongest response. Maya felt rage flare through her grief. People's fear had been the reward. Their admiration had been validation. The most disturbing realization came slowly as Maya turned page after page. The writer didn't see himself as hiding anything. He saw himself as elevating it. He believed he was transforming people society had deemed worthless into something valuable. He wrote about giving purpose to those who had none, about converting discarded lives into enduring art. The language was chilling in its detachment, its complete absence of remorse. Denai stopped reading abruptly, pushing her chair back. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. He talks about them like materials, she said hoarsely. Like they were never people at all. Maya nodded, her eyes still scanning the page. He knew, she said quietly. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he believed he was right. The entry about Marcus came halfway through one of the later journals. Maya recognized the date instantly. Her fingers trembled as she read, every word cutting deeper than the last. The writer described her uncle's military service, his visible exhaustion, his gratitude for the offer of shelter. He noted the tattoo and the birthmark not as identifiers, but as design features, assets, enhancements. Denai covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He knew about me, she whispered. He knew Marcus had family. The journal confirmed it. The writer had documented conversations, casual remarks made by victims before they were killed. He knew people would miss them. He simply didn't care. In fact, the knowledge seemed to heighten his sense of superiority. He wrote about invisibility as an advantage, about how society's indifference created space for his work to exist undisturbed. Maya felt a deep, consuming anger take hold. This wasn't madness, this was ideology. The journals revealed a worldview built on hierarchy, on the belief that some lives existed solely to be used. The horror of Ravenhill Estate wasn't just the violence. It was the philosophy behind it. The detective warned them that reading further might be more than they could bear, but Denai shook her head. I need to know, she said. If my brother was reduced to words on these pages, I need to see them. They read until their eyes burned, and their hands ached from gripping the edges of the table. Each entry added weight, not just to the case, but to the understanding of how long this had gone on, and how confidently. The writer had documented his work for over a decade, adjusting methods, expanding his collection, measuring success by public reaction. The house had been both workshop and gallery. When they finally stopped, the room felt unbearably quiet. Maya stared at the last page she had read, the neat handwriting blurring through tears she hadn't noticed falling. The journals had taken the horror out of the abstract and pinned it to intention. This wasn't something that had spiraled out of control. It had been cultivated. The detective gathered the pages carefully, stacking them with practiced respect. "These journals will be critical," he said. "They establish intent, pattern, premeditation." Maya nodded numbly. Denise wiped her face, straightening her shoulders. "Use them," she said firmly. "Use every word." As they left the room, Maya felt a strange shift inside her. The journals had done something devastating and clarifying all at once. They had stripped away any remaining illusion that this could be explained as an isolated crime. What had happened at Ravenhill Estate was a manifestation of something deeper, something that thrived on neglect, on dehumanization, on silence. The journals would speak now. They would testify to the lives taken and the mindset that made taking them feel justified. And Maya knew with painful certainty that reading them had changed her. The story was no longer just about finding her uncle. It was about exposing the beliefs that allowed him and so many others to be erased. Marcus Robinson had not always been invisible. There was a time when his name was spoken with pride, when his uniform drew nods of respect, when his presence filled rooms with an easy warmth that made people feel protected simply by standing near him. He enlisted young, driven by a belief that service meant something, that sacrifice would be met with care on the other side. He returned older in ways no one could see at first, carrying a war that refused to stay overseas. The medals were real. So were the nightmares. What failed him was not his strength, but the absence of a system willing to meet him where he landed. After the service, Marcus tried. That was the part people often forgot. He tried to work regular hours, tried to sleep through the night, tried to explain to doctors what it felt like to wake up gasping for air, because his body still believed it was under fire. Appointments were rushed, paperwork piled up, benefits were delayed, denied, or lost in administrative loops that assumed persistence equaled wellness. When he missed deadlines, it was labeled noncompliance. When he missed calls, it was noted as lack of engagement. The language was clean and bureaucratic, far removed from the reality of a man unraveling quietly. Denise watched it happen in slow motion. She offered her couch, her spare room, her patience. Marcus accepted help in fragments, his pride battling his exhaustion. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to be another problem the family had to manage. He drifted not because he didn't care, but because staying still made the memories louder. The streets offered anonymity, a strange sense of control, no expectations, no questions he couldn't answer. That vulnerability was visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. The journals made it clear that someone had been looking. Not with concern, not with empathy, but with calculation. The writer noted Marcus's military background not as a reason for care, but as an explanation for why he would be isolated, tired, hungry for stability. Teased was not seen as an illness. It was an opportunity. Veterans, the writer observed, often carried guilt and obedience in equal measure. They were trained to follow instructions. They were accustomed to authority. They were less likely to resist if offered structure, shelter, purpose. The cold precision of that assessment made Maya's blood run hot. Marcus's final days were reconstructed through fragments, a conversation near the riverfront, an offer of temporary work, a promise of a warm place to sleep. Nothing about it would have raised alarms. It mirrored the interactions Marcus had navigated for years, the small negotiations of survival that defined his life after the war. Trust wasn't blind. It was conditioned by need. The journals noted his gratitude, his exhaustion, his relief. Those were written down like inventory details, stripped of humanity, reduced to indicators of success. What cut deepest was the acknowledgement that Marcus spoke about his family. He mentioned his sister. He mentioned having people who worried about him. That knowledge didn't deter the writer. It enhanced the act. There was a perverse satisfaction in knowing someone would search, would H, would never quite let go. The system had taught the writer that those searches would be tolerated, even pitied, but rarely pursued with urgency. Veterans struggling with mental health were categorized quickly. Adults had the right to disappear. Cases closed quietly. The journals treated that reality as a feature, not a flaw. Maya understood then that her uncle had been failed long before he was taken. Failed when care was rationed. Failed when trauma was treated as inconvenience. Failed when homelessness erased credibility. Failed when missing person reports were filtered through bias instead of urgency. The crime didn't begin in the basement workshop. It began in waiting rooms, in underfunded clinics, in policies that measured worth by productivity and stability. The house simply exploited what the world had already decided. Denise read the entry about Marcus over and over, not because she needed to understand what happened, but because she needed to sit with the truth of how clearly her brother had been seen and still discarded. The man who wrote those pages noticed everything the system had overlooked and used it. That realization reshaped her grief into something sharper. It wasn't just about mourning Marcus. It was about confronting the lie that his outcome was inevitable. In the days that followed, as investigators spoke publicly about patterns and vulnerabilities, Marcus's story became emblematic of something larger. A veteran who served and returned to silence. A man whose struggles were documented but not addressed. A disappearance explained away by circumstance rather than investigated as a crime. Maya watched the narrative form and felt both pride and fury. Pride that her uncle's life mattered enough to illuminate injustice. Fury that it took his death to make people listen. Marcus Robinson had been many things: a soldier, a brother, an uncle, an artist with restless hands, and a laugh that came easily when he felt safe. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not collateral damage. He was a person whose vulnerability was manufactured by neglect and then exploited by cruelty. The journals tried to reduce him to material. The investigation restored his name. For Maya, understanding how and why her uncle had been targeted changed the shape of her grief. It gave it direction. The system that abandoned Marcus did not get to frame his death as tragedy alone. It was failure, layered and preventable. And as his story moved from private loss to public reckoning, one truth remained immovable: Marcus deserved protection long before he needed justice. The destruction of Ravenhill Estate happened quietly, without ceremony, long after the cameras had gone and the crowds had lost interest. The city deemed the property unsuitable for reuse, too contaminated by what had been uncovered, too steeped in harm to ever be repurposed. When the demolition crews arrived, there were no onlookers cheering or protesting. Just the steady rhythm of machinery and the slow collapse of walls that had hidden suffering behind spectacle for decades. Maya stood with her mother at a distance as the house came down, dust rising into the air like a final exhale. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say to the building. It had given up its secrets. Its work was done. In the months that followed, the empty lot remained untouched, a scar in the neighborhood that people learned to walk around. Then, gradually, it changed. The city approved a proposal not for development, but for remembrance. Trees were planted first, young and fragile, arranged in a wide circle that invited quiet rather than attention. Pathways followed, simple and unadorned, designed for walking, for thinking. At the center, space was left open. It would not be filled with anything ornate. It would be filled with names. The memorial did not announce itself loudly. There were no flashing signs, no dramatic sculptures. Each name was etched into stone with care, accompanied by a photograph taken before life narrowed into survival. Faces smiling, young, tired, hopeful, complicated. Maya insisted on that last part. She wanted the memorial to reflect lives as they had been lived, not sanitized or flattened into symbols. These were not victims first. They were people. When the memorial opened, families gathered who had never met before, bound together by a shared absence. Some arrived with photographs clutched tightly to their chests. Others brought stories they had been holding onto for years, waiting for someone who would listen. There were tears, but there was also recognition. A shared understanding that grief multiplied when it was finally seen. Denise stood beside Maya, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder as they listened to names being spoken aloud. Each one landed with weight. Each one mattered. The nonprofit began as an idea scribbled on legal pads and napkins, fueled by exhaustion and anger and an unwillingness to let the story end in outrage alone. Maya didn't want to build something symbolic. She wanted something functional. Something that intervened where the system failed. With the help of attorneys, social workers, and a few officials who had been shaken deeply by the case, the organization took shape. Its mission was simple in language and ambitious in scope: to ensure that missing people, regardless of housing status or background, were investigated thoroughly and treated with dignity. Denise retired early, redirecting the energy she had once poured into searching for her brother into helping others navigate the same nightmare she had survived. She knew how to make calls that didn't get returned turn into calls that couldn't be ignored. She knew how to document conversations, how to insist without burning bridges, how to keep cases alive when the world tried to move on. Families trusted her because she spoke from experience, not training manuals. The work was slow and often frustrating. Systems resist change even when exposed. Policies took time to revise. Training took time to implement. There were setbacks, arguments, compromises that felt too small against the scale of what had been lost. But there were also moments that mattered. A case reopened, a search expanded, a missing person found alive because someone refused to accept the first explanation offered. Those moments accumulated quietly, steadily. Maya shifted her life to accommodate the work. She changed her field of study, focused her energy on advocacy, learned the language of policy and procedure without losing sight of the human cost behind it. She spoke publicly when asked, careful not to sensationalize, careful to redirect attention from the horror itself to the conditions that allowed it to exist. She talked about invisibility, about bias, about how easily suffering becomes background noise. She talked about her uncle as a person, not an example. As the nonprofit grew, it became a place where grief was not rushed. Families were encouraged to tell their stories fully, without editing them to fit expectations. Some cried. Some raged. Some sat in silence for long stretches, unsure how to speak now that someone was finally listening. Maya learned that healing did not look like closure. It looked like community, like persistence, like refusing to let names fade. The memorial park became a living space, rather than a static monument. People walked their dogs along the paths. Children played nearby. Volunteers tended the gardens. On anniversaries, families gathered to place flowers beneath the stones, to read names aloud, to remind the city why the space existed. It was not a place of fear. It was a place of accountability. Years passed. The headlines faded, but the work continued. Cases that would have gone cold were pursued longer. Protocols changed incrementally. Officers received training that emphasized thoroughness over assumptions. Liaison roles were created to build trust with communities long ignored. It was not perfect. It would never be enough to balance what had been taken. But it was something. And something, Maya had learned, could save lives. On a quiet afternoon, Maya visited the memorial alone. The trees had grown taller, their branches beginning to knit together overhead. She stopped at her uncle's stone, tracing his name with her fingers. She didn't speak aloud this time. She didn't need to. The work spoke for her. The lives touched, the searches continued, the people found. None of it erased the loss. But it honored it. Denise joined her, standing close, comfortable in the silence they shared now. He'd be proud, she said softly. Maya nodded. She believed it. Not because the world had changed enough, but because they had refused to let it stay the same. The house that once hid cruelty was gone. In its place stood something quieter and far more powerful: memory, action, and the stubborn insistence that no one should disappear without being searched for, named, and remembered. This story teaches us that the most dangerous horrors are not always born from chaos or madness, but from systems that quietly decide whose lives matter and whose do not. The violence at the center of the narrative is extreme, but it is not random. It thrives because neglect creates opportunity. When institutions grow accustomed to overlooking certain people, those without stable housing, those struggling with mental illness, those returning from war without adequate support, absence becomes normalized. Disappearance is reframed as choice. Silence becomes explanation. The story forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that cruelty often does not need secrecy to survive, it only needs indifference. Another core lesson lies in how easily suffering can be disguised when it is packaged attractively. Ravenhill Estate succeeds for years not because people are evil, but because they are trained to value aesthetics, novelty, and entertainment over scrutiny. Visitors admire realism without asking what it costs. Authorities inspect property without questioning its origins. Professionals appraise objects while never imagining they should ask whether an object should exist at all. The story warns us that when admiration replaces accountability, harm can hide in plain sight. Evil does not always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks impressive, profitable, or well-made. The narrative also exposes how deeply bias shapes justice. Every victim mattered, but not every victim was treated as if they did. Reports were filed, calls were made, families begged for help, yet investigations stalled because assumptions stepped in to replace effort. The story teaches that inequality does not only show up in overt violence. It appears in which cases are prioritized, which questions are asked, and how long authorities are willing to search before deciding a life is no longer worth the resources. Justice fails not only when laws are broken, but when concern is rationed. At the heart of the story is the idea that recognition is powerful and dangerous to systems built on neglect. The moment the truth is seen and named, everything changes. One person recognizing a tattoo, one family refusing to accept dismissal, one voice insisting on reality disrupts years of silence. This teaches us that awareness is not passive. To truly see something is to become responsible for it. Once we recognize injustice, neutrality becomes a choice, and often a harmful one. The story reminds us that change rarely begins with institutions, it begins with individuals who refuse to look away. The transformation of grief into action is another essential lesson. The narrative does not present healing as forgetting or closure, but as purpose. The pain does not vanish. The loss remains permanent. What changes is how that pain is used. Instead of allowing horror to end in spectacle or despair, the characters choose to redirect it into systems that protect others. This teaches that while trauma cannot be undone, it can be answered. Meaning does not erase loss, but it can prevent loss from becoming meaningless. The story also challenges the idea that monsters are anomalies. The antagonist is horrific, but he does not operate in isolation. He depends on social blind spots, institutional failures, and cultural narratives that excuse inaction. The lesson here is deeply unsettling. Removing one villain does not fix the conditions that allowed him to exist. True justice requires examining the environment that made his actions possible. Without systemic change, exposure alone is only temporary relief. Memory plays a moral role in the narrative as well. The act of naming, memorializing, and telling stories is not sentimental, it is corrective. Forgetting is not neutral, it is a continuation of harm. By insisting on remembrance, the story teaches that honoring the dead is inseparable from protecting the living. Memory becomes resistance against a world that prefers convenience over accountability. It says that being remembered is a form of dignity, and denying remembrance is another kind of violence. Finally, the story leaves us with a broader lesson about responsibility. It asks not only what one person did wrong, but what many people failed to do. It asks how often we accept easy explanations, how often we walk past suffering without inquiry, how often we trust that someone else will handle it. The narrative does not allow the reader to remain comfortable. It insists that societies are defined not by how they treat their most visible members, but by how fiercely they protect those who are easiest to ignore. In the end, the lesson of this story is not simply that terrible things happened, but that terrible things are allowed to happen when invisibility is treated as normal. It argues that justice begins attention, that dignity begins with recognition, and that change begins when we decide that no life is expendable. The horror fades, but the responsibility does not, and that may be the most important truth the story leaves behind. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.